You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next 45 minutes maybe, we are going to be profiling Chris Boucher so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
I'm Jim.
And I'm John.
And yeah, that's another new voice that you'll be hearing, or another new face that you'll be seeing if you're watching this on YouTube. So before we talk about Chris Boucher, let's talk about Jim Cameron. Because yes, another new invitee to the feed. Because I like to keep expanding the team, frankly. I think the more my philosophy on this, as I had mentioned when I was on the Time Lash the other week, is that this podcast has kind of morphed into one of those websites where you can go on and every day or 3 times a week, let's say, given that it's a podcast, you'll find new features, and the features might not necessarily be by the same people. So I like to think of this podcast as turning into a version of that, where you'll always get new things, some of which you might be interested in, some not, and you'll have new voices to listen to on each of them. So, Jim, for the benefit of anybody who's listening to this who doesn't know, and I can't imagine there'll be many, but would you like to tell everybody who you are and what you do, which being why I've asked you on?
It's a bit Cilla Black, that one. Blinder data. Yes, I am Jim Cameron from the, startup podcasting with the Crinoid podcast, a mainly classic Doctor Who review podcast monthly in disturbing length for anyone who, well, it doesn't disturb your sleep. I've heard it's quite a good thing to drop off to the Crinoid podcast, and we've nearly done that while recording it on occasion. But yeah, we did about 12 or 13 years of that. Family situations changed a bit, and I didn't have as much time to do that because that's a very time-consuming podcast. If you listen to it, there's a hell of a lot of I hesitate to say the word work, but it's a hell of a lot of time goes into it at any rate. So we decided that we were going to, when we finished that, we were going to go into Blake 7. So we decided to bring that in a bit earlier because it's just like a 50-minute episode to review each month was going to be a lot easier. So that's what we're doing now, the Mutual podcast. So tune in if you like a bit of Blake 7. We're just coming up to the end of Series A, I believe we're compelled to call the series of Blake 7. I have to stop myself saying season 1 at every single opportunity there. But yeah, we're at the moment I'm editing the penultimate episode of that series. There we go again.
Yeah.
So that'll be out sometime in this month, January. So yeah, tune in. There's a ton of back catalogue, and in fact, the first 30 episodes of the Crinoid podcast were not on the same provider, the same host. So I'm bunging out some of them more, well, they're fairly embarrassing, but certainly the earlier ones are more embarrassing. I'm pumping those out until we get those first 30 ones, so they're available everywhere, Audible and Spotify and iTunes and all the rest of it, because at the moment they aren't available in those places. So they will be soon. Whether that's a good thing, I'll leave that to the listener to decide.
So, for the sake of anybody who hasn't heard it, the Crinoid podcast is actually basically a scene-by-scene review of the stories that you go into, with sort of a summing up section at the end, which is quite a substantial sort of summing up section. But it's, if you're into Doctor Who and you know your Doctor Who, as well as a lot of people who are into Doctor Who know their Doctor Who, this is kind of the perfect podcast, because you kind of go through each scene and you sort of dissect it a bit, but also with a lot of humor and insight. And obviously those are the two magic ingredients for a podcast, really, aren't they? Humor and insight. That's really the two things that you come to a podcast for. So the Crinoid podcast for classic Doctor Who fans is sort of a little bit of magic, really, I would have said. And with
Bless you. I feel like a muggle, to be honest, but thanks.
Right, we better talk about Chris Boucher, otherwise we'll never get into it.
Yeah.
But just before we move on, and so this kind of bridges the gap in the conversation, do we know why they went with Series A and Series B rather than 1 and 2 and everything else?
I don't know. I don't know if it's a retrospective thing. Because, if you listen to anyone who talks about Doctor Who at the time, Terence Dicks or any of that lot, they always called it a series, didn't they? And it's claimed that a lot of people named it by the seasons kind of in retrospect, didn't they? which a lot of people consider that to be an
Yeah.
Americanism. But I mean, I grew up reading all those Peter Hennings books and all that kind of stuff. And I suppose even the Doctor Who magazine, they called it Seasons.
Well, I mean, the Blake 7 ones, the A and the B and the C and the D. Do we know about that? Is what I mean.
It's definitely there by
I know what
that
you mean. I'm
Marvel
just wondering.
special, isn't it? It's definitely there in that kind of, is it 93, 94 Marvel special? Don't know if it's there in the Outlook program guide.
Yeah, it could be. No, I'm comparing to that because it's just like a BBC thing. It's not everyone in the BBC probably called it Series A, because it's when you're working on it, it's current, isn't it? It's only when you look back at these things that you start categorising them. But I don't know the story behind that. I guess just different people involved have just called it something different. Well, I don't know whether it's a fan invention or not, to be honest with you. Maybe I'll delve into that before the next podcast.
Well, I mean, it occurs to me that it just sounds like it's probably a sort of fan concept, a bit like, as you were saying, sort of calling Doctor Who series seasons, which obviously is not what they were intended to be described as. Anyway, look, Chris Boucher, a couple of weeks ago, he died. And so on our feed, somebody said, well, we ought to do something about that. And I thought, well, rather than just do a lot sort of like because sometimes you'll do like a tribute, and before with actors, a couple of actors, we've sort of done a sort of top 3 favorite films or something like that to give us something to talk about, specifics, so that we can have a general conversation about the person. And I thought, well, we can't really do our top 3 favorite Chris Boucher Doctor Who stories because it kind of doesn't leave us an awful lot of room for maneuver. So I thought, instead of doing that, let's do an actual proper sort of profile episode. So I don't intend to go into it in a massive amount of depth, but I do think the story of Chris Boucher is quite a sort of interesting story in terms of his television career. And I think it's slightly a sad one as well, to be honest, although it's not without its high points, obviously. So let's go through it in some kind of order, sort of a chronological history of Chris Boucher, and we'll sort of gloss over the stuff that sort of isn't within our purview and get to the stuff that is. But I mean, he started on television. His first television credits came at the end of the 1960s, and he had a handful of episodes of programs that are so long forgotten. I've got them written down in front of me, and I still can't bring myself to say them because I've just never heard of them. The first couple of things that we would know, in 1973 he wrote something for That's Life, and in 1973 and 1975 he had a couple of credits on a couple of episodes of Dave Allen at Large. Do either of you know Dave Allen? Just as a sort of
yeah.
Oh, I love Dave Allen. Yeah.
May your God go with you.
Yeah. In my childhood, I don't know what age I would have started watching him, but I saw a lot of his stuff go out live in the 1970s, and I don't know, it was obviously for grown-ups, but there's something about it that appealed to a sort of pre-teen me. Anyway, there's a couple more credits. Romany Jones, he did a couple of episodes, and in 1974 on ITV he had a sort of TV film, a sort of comedy, sort of 75-minute thing, I think it was, called Slater's Day. And then you've got a 3-year gap, and suddenly in 1977 he's got 3 Doctor Who stories basically on the trot. I mean, it's 3 stories out of 6 in running order, although it's spread between 2 different series. But that's quite incredible for him to come from this background where he's got bits of episodes of things and not very much, and then suddenly a TV movie, and then suddenly Doctor Who, which is not prime time television, but pretty much up there. Do we know, John, I'll come to you because you're the man who used to write for Shooty Dog Thing. How did Chris Boucher get involved with Doctor Who then?
I believe it was his agent at the time, because he was while he was writing the comedy bits earlier, he was working for Cala Gas, if I remember rightly, but he wanted to get out of it at that point. So his agent knew that Doctor Who was quite willing to have a look at spec scripts. So he sent him one, which I believe was the Silent Scream, Jim, yeah?
Sorry, yeah.
Yep. And obviously they saw that script. They couldn't make it, probably too high a budget for a start off. And they got him to work on more scripts, essentially.
And The Face of Evil, or The Day God Went Mad, as it was the first one to come out of that. I mean, Jim, John says his agent was saying that Doctor Who were prepared to look at new writers, but actually the writers on Doctor Who had been on a bit of a treadmill for about the past 6 or 7 years. It's not that sort of usual, really, for new writers to come through on Doctor Who, not in the 1970s. So I think this is a tribute to Boucher, that he wrote something that was strong enough that they would go on to sort of ask him for a script and put it on the telly. So what do we think of sort of Chris Boucher appearing like that? That's got to be a credit to him, right?
Definitely. I guess Robert Holmes was a script editor at the time, wasn't he? And it's been quite often been said that Chris Boucher was kind of like a protege. Protege, I mean,
Protege, yeah.
A protege for him. And yeah, there's some similarities in the way they're right, but I don't think he was intending to ape him, or Robert Holmes intending to create a clone of himself. But yeah, he was coming towards the end of his run, wasn't he, Robert Holmes, at this point? And commissioning writers as he had to do in those days is difficult. And you don't know whether somebody dropped out. I mean, I don't think the Bristol boys doing anything at this time. They
had the fear, so they were there. They were this.
And they were in the vicinity, so maybe it wasn't them. You just get the feeling that maybe one of the kind of stalwarts wasn't available, and to get two in a season like that is unusual. In terms of, I can't remember the production order, but in terms of televised order, they're right next to each other. It's very unusual, particularly for a new writer.
Actually, I wonder, because Robert Banks Stewart, his story fell out, didn't it? And Holmes ended up
Killer Cats of Jim Sang, yeah.
And so,
yes.
And so Robert Banks Stewart.
No, hang on, isn't that?
And that turns.
That's the Graham Williams era, isn't it? That one?
No, it's the one that I think Robert Holmes has to write Talons to replace it fairly quickly, if I remember rightly.
No, that's Invasion of Time. The one that you're thinking of is
Foe from the Future.
That's the one.
Foe
from the Future. That's right. Yes. Point being, actually, I think there's a little confluence of interest here, because Robert Banks Stewart goes off to create Shoestring, doesn't he? So when Foe from the Future falls through, Robert Holmes has to take over on that. And I wonder if partly Chris Boucher was a golden find for Robert Holmes because he didn't have to rewrite him. Or maybe there's a slight case for, well, Robert Holmes just didn't have time to rewrite him. So Chris Boucher got a bit lucky and got his scripts through without too much rewriting going on. And basically, as you kind of alluded to, Jim, these are clearly two sort of similar souls, both in terms of personality as well as writing, I would have said, from what we know about Robert Holmes and what we've seen on him on the few sort of video instances we've got. You can clearly see that he and Boucher would have got along. So I just... right person at the right place at the right time, I think. So let's talk a little bit about. Go on.
So I was just going to say about dialogue. I mean, there's somebody who clearly loves language as much as Robert Holmes does. Yeah. I mean, he's for us, Doctor Who watchers, there's certain archaic words that are probably dead to everyone else, but we still will drop into conversation because of Robert Holmes. And if you were to ask me like one adjective. Is it an adjective? Anyway, one thing about Chris Boucher that you like, number one on my list is dialogue. Particularly because of Blake 7. So you can see that they, in Kindred Spirits, you can see you don't want somebody who's just like pumping out, no disrespect to Terry Nation, who I expect we'll talk about fairly soon. Perhaps a sci-fi by numbers type scripts where people are just saying what needs to be said for the script to go forward. Somebody like Chris Boucher and someone like Robert Holmes will like to make that a little bit more fluid and make the scripts more enjoyable to listen to, even more enjoyable for the actors to perform. You could see that there's a very close connection between the two, I think, in terms of style.
Oh yeah,
and I would add to that, I think, intertwined with dialogue. And if you read Chris Boucher's interviews, his sense of humour is very similar to the one you get from Robert Holmes, and I think they just gel perfectly on that.
Oh yeah. Well, you're the classic example of the inverse ratio being one of the great Doctor Who lines of all time. And if you didn't know, you would swear that was written by Robert Holmes, wouldn't you? And yet,
probably. Yeah.
But the interesting thing in what Jim just said is that you don't want to do sci-fi by numbers, but you want proper character. something for a Saturday evening audience to engage with, and clearly Boucher's providing that. Although I'm going to sort of probably argue with myself in a moment or two about quite the direction that the series might have been heading. But the other thing is sci-fi by numbers, and when he does The Day God Went Mad, The Face of Evil, the weird thing about that is that that's a proper classic science fiction story trope. And it's not the most original, although it feels original because of the way he does it. But the way he does it, the way he brings it to life is brilliant. And actually, I think that's the first time, perhaps ever, but certainly since the 1960s, that we have something that sort of conceptually strong, but conceptually complex on television in their Doctor Who slot, you know, in a decade, because that's not really what Doctor Who audiences would have come to expect. So what do you two think of The Face of Evil? I think it's really good and rather underrated myself. Jim, what are your thoughts on The Face of Evil?
I loved it. I mean, it's one of those ones that really stuck in my mind as a kid. It really made a big impression. It looks odd, doesn't it? It looks quite different to everything else that's around. Then I suppose there's a whiff of Planet of Evil in the way it looks in terms of the jungle. But it's so odd. I mean, it's got, like you say, it's got a kind of a sci-fi staple of a computer that gets out of control. But this is done in such a weird sort of schizophrenia AI type of way that, and it's caused by the Doctor as well, which is a really interesting twist. And the sort of Mount Rushmore visuals is, it's a really striking piece of work, I think. But I think one of the things he's really good at is taking ideas that you've perhaps seen before, mixing them together to form sort of new alloyed ideas or whatever, and then giving them a kind of a twist. So, I mean, the divergent evolution that you get from the two sections of the survey, was it the survey team and the technicians? You get the tech and the severed team going complete different directions. It's a bit, I suppose, a bit H.G. Wells, you know, Eloy and Morlocks. But it's got a twist, and the whole thing, it still feels fresh if you watch that now, Face of Evil. And it introduced whether or not it was timing, what the age that I was, or the performance, but certainly partly the script. My favourite Doctor Who companion, which is Leela. So made a huge impression on me, that, and I've loved it ever since, really.
I got to agree on Leela. I think a lot of that is down to Louise Jamieson's performance as well. John, The Face of Evil.
Well, it's such an odd story for the time, because it's the first story in, it's got to be pre-Pertwee era, hasn't it, that you don't have any actual monsters in it. You know, I know you've got the technically invisible things, but they're not really monsters. It's different. It's drawing on different sources to the rest of that Robert Holmes era. You know, the rest of that Robert Holmes era, it's monsters. It's you know, Hammer horror sci-fi.
Or he likes to get, I mean, Holmes and Hinchcliffe have said they prefer villains to monsters, but obviously they still put monsters in because it was Doctor Who. But this is a story with neither villains nor monsters, really. And sort of Jim talks about the computer. It's not a classic villain, is it?
It's got that possession thing that the Hinchcliffe Holmes era has, though, doesn't it? It's the Doctor's essentially possessed the computer. So it fits in that dual personality thing that runs through that era so perfectly. But yeah, it's an absolutely really striking thing. I first encountered in the Target book, and it's a fairly bland adaptation, I would say. And then you watch the TV production. Yeah, it's Terrance Dicks in late 70s mode, isn't it? And then you come to watch it and you go, actually, this is just. And I think I watched it when I was, got to be like whenever the VHS came out, which was mid 90s, so early 20s. That's a perfect age for that to hit you, because it's playing with big, strong ideas, and it's carving a story. And that cliffhanger to part 3 is one of the best cliffhangers in Doctor Who.
Although the cliffhanger to part 1's pretty good as well.
Oh yeah,
because I do love a WTF cliffhanger, and the cliffhanger at part 1 for all sorts of reasons, not least of which the model itself doesn't look like anything other really than a model. But when you realise what it's a model of, you really sort of scratch your head. But look, let's move on, because we don't want to dwell too much on Doctor Who, otherwise we'll never get to some of the other more interesting, perhaps, things. Everything that can be said about the Robots of Death probably has been. It's probably not as clever of a whodunit as it could have been, but I don't think that's the important thing. As a character piece with creepy mechanical men, it is one of the greats of all time in Doctor Who, and I'm sure the other two of you agree with me on that. I'm assuming, John.
No, it's a brilliant. A lot of the success of it is in the design work. I think Chris Boucher admitted that as well, didn't he? It just looks beautiful. It's he's taking.
But the script is still amazing, though. I think.
Oh, the dialogue in it. Yes, I've rewatched it since I think we did the top 20 story. That all-time top stories, and I said I don't think it was a top 20. But you can still put it on. It is still so watchable, so beautifully shot and tense all the way through. It gets a perfect director.
Jem.
Yeah, well, the director wasn't very keen on the script, was he? Was it Michael Bryan?
It was, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Michael Bryan. Yeah, he wasn't very keen on the script. Oh God, another robots thing, how boring. But it proved to be a very collaborative effort, didn't it? Where he was sitting down with the designers and everyone else to just create a believable world. And although it's set on a sand mine, and you haven't got people wandering around in sort of overalls and stuff, you've got, because most of the work is done by these incredibly elegant robots. Again, to please the people on the sand mine. Most of the time they're not really working, so they're lounging about wearing extraordinary hats and amazing clothes. So yeah, a lot of the impact of that is down to the visuals, but like JR was saying, the script absolutely crackles in that.
Yeah, and having said that, all that stuff does come out of the script because it is a story about the sort of indolent crew of the sand miner being attacked by the robots that they take for granted, and all that's there on the page. That stuff isn't something that was sort of created in the sort of director's sort of common room, whatever. So yeah, I do think it's an extraordinary piece of writing, because I think it takes a little bit of vision to look at something like Doctor Who and say, let's tell a story about sort of a future age where robots do all the work and the humans are so unused to actually having to work that all they do is just sit around bickering with one another. It's terrific.
Yeah. It's a dependence on the robots is their weak point, isn't it? Which Taron Capel exploits.
And the Robots of Death, I have to say, is also, and Chris Boucher in particular, actually, responsible for getting me back into Doctor Who, because I drifted in the wilderness years and I kept half an eye on the programme, but it was the DVD of this. I didn't buy the DVD of the Five Doctors when it came out, because I thought 20 quid for something with barely any extras, and it's a Peter Davison story, no thanks. But when the Robots of Death came out, I splashed out for it. And I tell you what, the commentary track on there with Hinchcliffe and Boucher, it's come in for a lot of criticism given the commentary tracks that you'd subsequently have. But I got to say, the sort of 90 minutes or so that I spent just sort of sitting on my sofa watching the story with those two sort of just chatting about it, that was an experience that really turned me back into Doctor Who, I think. So Chris Boucher is sort of partly responsible for the reason why I'm doing this podcast in the first place, I have to say, because otherwise I wouldn't be doing this if that hadn't have happened, would I?
No, exactly. No, sometimes you just need a reminder about how bloody good it was.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's a shame he couldn't do more of the DVD commentaries. I think he had a condition where he couldn't, he got on camera and just froze, if I remember rightly. So there's not that much material from him.
Oh, what a shame. Anyway, next up, at the start of the next series, not the first story, but early in the next series, is Image of the Fendal, which I think kind of, because of the nature of the first two stories, this one kind of gets forgotten a little bit. Not by people like Matt, I guess, because it's right in his wheelhouse with the sort of folk horror sort of elements of it. But I think in terms of Doctor Who, Image of the Fendal kind of gets forgotten a little bit, but conceptually and in character terms, I think it's probably just as strong as the other two. Jim, what do you think?
I think that's probably true. I don't like it as much as the other two. I think this was big, even at my age at the time. This was when Doctor Who was beginning to lose its luster a little bit for me. And this was actually one of the last things that I really enjoyed. Invisible Enemy being another one, believe it or not. There's no time for taste.
I'm right with you on that, though.
Oh, good. Yeah, not many people are. I mean, it's a ton of fun, and this is a ton of fun, isn't it, Fendal? I mean, again, you're talking about you're taking sort of fairly well-worn ideas and forming into something new for Doctor Who. I mean, this is very Eric von Däniken, isn't it? You know, the ancient man being influenced by aliens and all that kind of thing. And you've got a very kind of H.P. Lovecraft ancient evil, haven't you?
It's sort of von Däniken meets Quatermass, I guess. Sort of Nigel Neal. So yeah,
as well. Yeah. But it manages to make it sort of Doctor Who-y because it's set in that kind of old house. So it's got woods where horrible things happen to people in the woods, and again it's got a really excellent script. I mean, I'm not that keen on the performance of I've forgotten the guy's name, the guy who discovers the skull in the first place and then gets funding from
Fendelman.
Fendel.
Yeah,
and it's the other guy who discovers it, isn't it? It's the young lad.
Maximilian Style, isn't it?
No, it's the other one.
Yeah. Those are the two good ones, John. That's why you remember them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this guy is very. I mean, if I have to fault any of the script, I mean, it might be in the performance, to be honest, but he's always coming out with these one-liners which aren't at all funny. And that's probably partly to do with his delivery. He's incredibly smarmy. But when you get a decent actor, like the guy playing Fendelman, whose name escapes me at the moment.
From Survivors.
It's from Survivors, yes.
Dennis Lill?
Dennis Lill, that's it.
Dennis Lill, thank you, yes. When you get someone like Dennis Lill delivering lines written by Chris Boucher, even though he has to put an accent on, he's got that kind of stillness as an actor, isn't he, where he really draws attention out of any lines that he's got to deliver. And you've got the guy playing Stahl, who also appears in Blake 7. And it's a very strong cast. So we've got Wanda Bentham, haven't we, as the person who comes to possess. And the sort of slightly country bumpkin family. There's all these really good ingredients that get pushed into this thing, and somehow they make it work. And that has to be down a lot to the writer, doesn't it?
There's a tension between the extremely rural or the extremely primitive and the extremely futuristic here and in the Face of Evil, and I guess kind of in the Robots of Death, because the tension there is between the humans who've kind of reverted back to a sort of more relaxed way of living and the robots. So that's the tension that he plays with all the time. John, what do you think of Image of the Fendel?
Oh, I know. It's that last gasp of the Hinchcliffe era, isn't it? It's the last time until well into the Gent era that they can actually go to scare the buggers to death, as the phrase went. It's just a really well told ghost story. Again, this was one I did remember from the Target, because you read the Target and you read that introduction with the hiker, and this is on screen, and you're just going, bloody hell, get that at 6 or 7 years old, you're terrified. And that's why I think it's always been my favorite of all his scripts, going right back to that, because it probably fits more into Doctor Who in that way. But a thing that always struck me about the Doctor Who things, they're all such very different stories, even if they're playing, as you say, with a lot of the same themes. There's 2 science fiction ones that, again, very different, and then a ghost story on Earth. I can't think of any writer whose stories are so different, who's got that range to them.
Now, the interesting thing that happens next in Chris Boucher's career is he moves on to Blake 7. Robert Holmes moves off Doctor Who. Philip Hinchcliffe gets pushed off Doctor Who. It's often been said that sort of Holmes was kind of, well, as you say, had Boucher as a kind of protege, and that Boucher would have been Holmes' natural successor as a script editor on Doctor Who. And people often sort of speculate about what Doctor Who might have been like had that happened. But I've got to say, you've got to look at the situation and think, I don't think that really is something that would have happened. If Hinchcliffe had still been around, maybe he might have favoured Boucher. But I've got to say, given the way things went, they were obviously looking, the BBC, to make a change. And Boucher was already moving off to do Blake 7. And you've got to think that the sort of, because when Blake 7, I could be completely misremembering here from things I've read about Blake 7 in the past, so probably one or other of you can correct me here. I have a feeling that when Blake 7 was being set up, they wanted Robert Holmes, and Holmes said, no, I can't do it, but here's Boucher instead. Why not give him a try? Is that, you're both nodding, so I did get that right. So I've got to say, I don't think there's any situation in which Boucher would have stayed on and become the script editor in Doctor Who. And actually, the fact that Blake 7 was being set up was probably a lucky break for him, because that gave him the regular work instead. Now, we were just talking about tensions in storytelling. Well, here's the really big tension, isn't it? Because there are 13 episodes in that first series of Blake 7. They've all got Terry Nation's name on the script. And yet, as we all know, they were all, I don't want to say heavily rewritten by Chris Boucher, but he certainly gave all of them, at the very least, a bit of a polish, didn't he?
At the very least.
I mean, there's lots of Terry Nation in those scripts. You can feel the Terry Nation in the scripts. More than just the character names, but the story beats and things like that, and the places they go to and the things that they do. There's a lot of Terry Nation there. But you can also feel that the dialogue has entirely been given the magic rub of Chris Boucher's pen, hasn't it?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, Nation's just such a functional dialogue writer. You know, you just, it's almost leaden stuff. The Harrison Ford to George Lucas line. You know, you can write this, but you can't say it.
I do think we do him a bit of a disservice, but yeah, for the sake of this conversation.
He's not as bad as Lucas, that's for sure.
True. But yeah, absolutely. You know, there's I think Chris Boucher said, wasn't it, that Nation scripts could come in a tad short, quite infamously.
Understatement.
So I think he had to do a lot of work to fill in the hole, so to speak, on a lot of these.
I think Terry Nation had overcommitted himself, really. To be fair, I mean, we're used to him, you know, giving out sort of story ideas on the back of a fag packet to someone like, I don't know, Terence Dixon in Doctor Who. And then basically the whole thing's constructed from those basic ideas. And certainly, I think towards the end of the first series of Blake 7, that is what was happening. I think Terry Nation turned his attentions to what is a kind of a two-parter at the end. And, you know, the 2 or 3 episodes before that, you can see suffer a little bit. And I expect Chris Boucher was worked up his feet trying to get those into something in shape, in the right sort of timing, because they're running out of time as well. But I think it's... oh,
go on, sorry.
Sorry, but I think it's testament to Boucher's skill that you get these episodes that are as good as they are, given what was going on at the time. And if you didn't know that, you may not even notice any bumps in the road along there, because, you know, Boucher gets in and it sorts it out, and, you know, you can paper over quite a lot of cracks with some decent dialogue, and I think that's what he ends up doing quite a lot, because if you've got space to fill, you probably need to have people talking, because that's the cheapest thing to do. And if you have people saying stuff that people want to hear, so much better.
Well, yeah, when you've got 6 strong characters in a sort of, it's basically Blake 7 is 6 strong characters in a confined space who don't necessarily get on with each other, and that's what makes it work so well. I was going to say, on Survivors, just a couple of years earlier, Nation had basically written every 4th script. He'd have, of the 13 episode series, he'd written episodes 1, 4, 9, and 13 or something. And then the other ones in between had been another 3 writers, basically each doing every 4th script as well. Not exactly, but that's kind of how it worked out. The amazing thing about Blake 7, that first series at least, is that it is entirely the work of 2 writers, really, isn't it, that first series? Yep. And there are no guest writers at all in those first 13 episodes. That is a hell of an achievement, really. And yeah, we can laugh at and take the piss out of Terry Nation a bit, but he still did put in a lot of work before those scripts went to Chris Boucher. So it's a sort of collaboration, even if it's a sort of accidental one.
And it's one of those situations where probably had he not put his name, which had a lot of kudos at the time, to the first 13 episodes, it might never have happened. It's one of those things. Like, yeah, we'll do this, Terry, if you'll write all the first 13 episodes. I mean, it may not even have been his choice, but certainly he was flagging, as anyone would be. I mean, we do, like to say, we do probably underestimate Terry Nation often for comic effect, but that's a lot to take on. And the bare bones of all the episodes are pretty good, and that will be his work. The scaffolding is his at the very least, and then Boucher sprinkles some magic on it, and again he's working with some ideas that we've seen before several times, and he makes them seem modern and adult, because this was, although it looks quite a lot like Doctor Who, it's not aimed at the same market, the same audience. And if you've still got spaceships flying around and people are not saying very interesting things, you could say, well, this is still a kids program. But if you got the tensions that are on display, I mean, it's partly set up with the Dirty Dozen in space idea that Terry Nation had, but the shades of grey and the moral ambiguity in there, coupled with some really excellent dialogue, is what makes it compelling viewing. It's what made it so popular, I think.
And this is why Boucher's the perfect person to take on those dialogues, those characters, because looking back at his 3 Doctor Who stories, they are too grown up for the 8-year-olds. Really, they just about get away with it with those 3 stories. But I think if it had been true that Boucher was being set up to take over Doctor Who, and if he had, I don't think Chris Boucher's version of Doctor Who, which would have skewed upwards from Robert Holmes, I think, because Robert Holmes had all that experience of writing during the sort of Terrance Dicks and Barry Letts era, when it was being aimed at the 8 to 12-year-olds, and he skewed it slightly upwards from that. But I think if you'd have skewed it slightly upwards again with Boucher, you would have skewed it too far, and it would have become the Eric Saywood era, essentially. And
with
I don't
dialogue.
think maybe, but I don't think we'd be as fond of Boucher as a writer as we are now if we'd have had him as script editor on Doctor Who instead of Blake Seven.
Yeah,
because they are two different beasts.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing with Doctor Who at the time, the BBC were looking to tone down Doctor Who, and I don't think Boucher would have done that at all.
No.
I mean, was it the first episode of Blake Seven? Did it go out? Was it 6 o'clock of an evening?
No, I don't think it.
It's 7 at the latest, I think.
7, yeah. I know later
it's
go
way
out something like 7.
Watershed.
Yeah, and you go, it's really strong material for that pre-Watershed era. What Blake's accused of, you wouldn't get that in a pre-Watershed show now.
No, there were different times. Let's not dwell again too much on Blake Seven, because I do want to try and keep this moving. And of course, if anybody wants to listen to a lot more chat about Blake Seven, they should really Google the Mutoid podcast, right?
Yeah. If you're prepared to go through it quite slowly, like we are, then yeah, please do. We'll just wait for a bit until we get a bit further, and then do them in a block.
And of course, there are other Blake Seven podcasts too, including many from Australia, which we shan't talk about.
I don't think there are, actually, Jen. I think you got that wrong.
No, okay, I might have made that up. But Chris Boucher stays with Blake Seven, and I guess after that first year, Blake Seven's not something that I'm much of an aficionado of, but I think by the end of it, it's basically Chris Boucher commissioning and overseeing all the scripts and stories, isn't it? Pretty much.
Yeah, particularly the last series.
Yeah. So Boucher is in a fairly strong position at this point, or would be, if it wasn't for the fact that Blake Seven is sort of so left field for something that's on sort of prime time BBC. So Boucher, after this, he gets some good work for the next few years, but I wonder if Blake Seven slightly does him a disservice, because he does a couple of series of Shoestring as script editor, a series of Juliet Bravo, a few series of Bergerac, and also a series of The Bill for ITV, and that's how he fills up most of the sort of early to mid 1980s. I suggest those are series where the script editor is probably not advertising himself in the way you might with something a bit higher profile. Those are the kind of series that are very strongly watched, but they're not necessarily high profile in terms of making a name for yourself, I think. I might be getting this completely the wrong way around, but I do wonder if, because clearly he goes into Shoestring because Robert Banks Stewart, and there's a connection there with Robert Holmes, I would have thought. And then after that, if you've done Shoestring, it's kind of natural to move on to other police procedurals, and Bergerac has that personal connection too, unless I'm misremembering. But I wonder if you've got a period in Boucher's career there where he's doing really good work on a lot of television that's being watched by an awful lot of people, but there's something ever so slightly anonymous about it. I don't know. Am I barking up the wrong tree there? Or do you think there's something fair in what I'm saying? Because what I'm looking at is I'm wondering why Boucher's career seems to end at the end of the 1980s in terms of television. I'm looking for clues as to why that happens. Jim, you were...
On those shows, I think perhaps he's a small fish in a big pond. I mean, he's clearly one of the two leading lights of Blake Seven, isn't he? Yeah, and people in the business would know that. Whereas these things, that his name is not connected to them in the same way, is it? If you see a good episode of Bergerac, you don't think, oh, Chris Boucher is not a name that springs up to mind, even if he wrote it or scripted it or whatever. Because
they're all showrunner-led shows, really, aren't they? Basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think that's why you might fade into the background. But again, in the business, people should be aware of that kind of thing. But if you keep producing, if you have a kind of fairly under the radar role in cop shows consecutively like that, eventually they're going to think, well, you're the cop show person, if they think of you at all. So maybe that's a problem. And Star Cops, of course, we'll get on to, obviously has an element of that and what he did before. So and it's something he led himself. So that becomes something different.
Yeah, and of course there's the interview. I think it's on the Caldor City website where he talks about he wants that credit on a creator-led show.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
To get his name. Yes.
Yeah.
And when it happens, it turns out to be a bit of a disaster. I mean, I'm not talking critically. I'm not talking. We look back. And a lot of people look back very, very fondly indeed on Star Cops. But in terms of its profile at the time, it kind of flopped, didn't it? So he actually does get the money and the wherewithal to make a series himself. Do we know how that came about?
I can't remember. All I know is that he doesn't talk about the producer of Star Cops fondly at all, nor I believe Jonathan Powell.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had a lot of gripes about the scheduling of Star Cops, because Powell, with science fiction, went, oh, it'll find its own audience, so he just shove it out here.
I wonder if the situation with Star Cops is a little bit like the situation we had with Class 5-6 years ago, because with Class I think everybody thought what a great idea, and then they started to make it and everybody got cold feet, and in the end it was kind of just shoved under the rug. And I don't know, I get the feeling kind of the same thing happened with Star Cops. They're sort of I mean, he's clearly doing good work for half a decade on all these cop shows, and so you can imagine that people would want him, given what he did on Blake 7, you'd imagine that people would want to give him a series. But then they give him a series, and when the scripts come in and they start going into the studio, people are probably thinking, well, have we bitten off a bit more than we can chew with this? Because I think it's the setting maybe of Star Cops that doesn't really do it too many favors.
Yeah, I think you have to be a fan of science or very hard science fiction to really get the most out of Star Cops. It reminds me very much of Moonbase 3, which I don't know if you've seen or not, which it's very bad. It got a very bad press at the time and it was very unpopular. I watched it a few years ago and it's a slow start, but I think it's brilliant by the end. I really enjoy it. But it's the
last episode's really good.
Yeah, I think the last three are classic. The last one particularly, but it's kind of set in the near future, so it doesn't really have that fantasy element. It's 2027. I looked up today, so very near future for us now. But back then, of course, they expected us to get a bit further than we've done in that kind of way. But I mean, it's not far enough in the future to be like Blake Seven or Star Trek or the futuristic episodes of Doctor Who, anything like that. So, and that in a way is a strength, but it's also, if you're a young science fiction fan, you may not get a lot out of Star Cops, and I certainly didn't at the time, even though I was probably about 19 or something when it came on. I started watching it a couple of years ago and really enjoyed it, and for some reason something got in the way and I never finished it, but I will go back. Maybe Chris Boucher's death would be a kick up the arse for me to go and do that. But yeah, it kind of falls between stools, I think, in the sense that it isn't like a full-blown, exciting Flash Gordon sci-fi thing, nor is it a kind of cop show that people can relate to particularly. So you get this, you're left in this kind of no man's land, I think, and I think the ratings reflect that.
I think, John, I don't know how you feel about this. Have you ever seen The Abyss, the James Cameron film? I think Star Cops is basically The Abyss, 2 years before The Abyss, and Cameron kind of showed what you can do with it. I think Star Cops shows where the limitations of a TV budget are going to hold you back, because character-wise, it's a really well-formulated series. I wonder if perhaps Boucher hasn't given you a character who you can really attach yourself to.
No, because Nathan, the lead of it, is not particularly sympathetic. I don't. Again, I was like Jim. I was even younger than Jim. I think I'd be 13 or 14 when it was out, and I watched it, and the first episode is very slow, and you're having to absorb you're having to absorb the world, and then you've got the mystery. I think it tries to do too much in that first episode. It doesn't end up telling a satisfying story. It doesn't quite end up establishing. I think it's a bit of a misfire, to be honest, on that front, and it does improve as it goes along. So we did rewatch that first episode, I think, a while ago, and my wife wouldn't watch the second one because she couldn't stand the first one. So it's again, I think it does fall between the stools. It's like Survivors ends up being. It falls between the stools of the vision of the producer and the vision of the show, of the script, the creator and the script writer.
Fair enough.
Sometimes that can create a decent tension where people spark off each other, but certainly not in this case.
No.
No, and I think
the same problems with Terry Nation and I've got the guy who wrote King Stevens, isn't it?
Terence Dudley.
Yeah, Terence Dudley. Thank you. Yeah. Terence Dudley wanted to make The Good Life, didn't they? Terry Nation wanted to make it.
I've got to say, well. I'm a big Survivors fan, and I've got to say, I think I prefer Terence Dudley's vision to Terry Nation's on that series. Although I can't argue with the Terry Nation episodes either, frankly. I mean, after Star Cops, his only other TV credits are just a couple of episodes of things in 1990 on ITV, one of which is The Bill. So, I mean, from this perspective, and I'd probably doing him a complete disservice, but it feels like a pity commission from somebody he used to work with a few years before, saying to the guy who had a flop with Star Cops, come and write an episode for us. But there's nothing else beyond that in terms of television.
I think he was involved with Moon and Son at one point.
Was he? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he had a credit on it, though, off the top of my head, but he did work on it.
So it doesn't entirely disappear, but for somebody who spent the decade between sort of 77 and 87 working constantly and pretty much always on really high profile programs, it seems shocking that his career basically comes to an end with the one flop being Star Cops. And you can't imagine really that happening these days. These days, when somebody has a shocker, a movie that tanks or a TV series that nobody watches, there might be a couple of fallow years afterwards where they sort of get back on their feet, but generally they do. And it seems to me shocking that Boucher never really does. And the only other things we've really got to talk about are sort of 4 novels and an episode of an independent sort of licensed audio series that, I mean, I think it's a sad end to what should have been a fantastic career that started out incredibly promisingly and just kind of I don't know, came to a dead end. What do you guys think, Jim?
I mean, it's shocking, isn't it? I mean, even if Star Cops didn't go as well as expected, I mean, the quality of the writing is evident, I think. And you'd think there might be a little bump in the road rather than a full stop, but I mean, it really is, isn't it? And you wonder who actually makes a living after this. You must just be doing something completely different, or something that is not shown up in any credits that we look at. But I mean, what waste, really? You know, someone who's that good at, you know, like you say, the plot construction, everything else in Star Cops is great. The dialogue is perhaps not quite as shining as it is in Blake 7, but you know, it's a well written show, and he's got a back catalogue of well written shows. You think, don't they need people like that, or didn't they need people like that anymore? It's very odd, isn't it? He just goes off the radar completely.
And the odd thing about it, I think, is that this happens at the beginning of the 1990s, and given the way the 1990s pans out, and given what Chris Boucher's writing was like, you'd think he was made for the 1990s. But well, just John, what do you?
Well, the BBC don't do much science fiction. He was kind of, I guess, seen as a science fiction writer, wasn't he, from his past successes?
Yeah.
But maybe, you know, why wasn't he invited for some like Bugs or Crime Traveller? Because he'd been ideal for one of those
stuff. Yeah. He's been a script editor on like 4 different crime series, and the 1990s is all crime series all the time, isn't it? And dark ones as well. It's character-led dark crime series. It's Chris Boucher's written all over it, and yet Chris Boucher's not writing at all.
I mean, the one thing I will say. Go on, Jim.
Sorry, maybe Star Cops was a wrong move in that sense, that he got back into science fiction, then when he stayed where he was, he might have had a really successful 1990s. Sorry.
It's all right. The one thing I'll say, it's one of those things. He's one of these earlier writers who gets kind of rescued by the fans, who you know, when he's down, the fans are picking him up, because obviously the BBC Worldwide come and ask him to write the 4 Doctor Who novels. I haven't read them, I think, in 25 years now, but if I remember rightly, he wasn't a particularly great prose writer. They don't quite match.
I got to say, I've not read many of the BBC novels. I've not, because I don't really do sort of peripheral Doctor Who media terrifically much. But the one that I did read, Corpse Marker, I thought was really well written, actually. Maybe I'm misremembering it.
I think I did. I might be remembering. He does struggle at first, certainly.
Maybe, yeah.
Was it science fiction? I think might be his first one. But
Last Man Running is first, then Corpse Marker, then science fiction, then Match of the Day.
Match of the Day is quite decent as well, I think, if I remember rightly. But yeah, and then Caldor City. The thing that really strikes me is how much people have made from creative material people have gotten from those worlds of his, particularly Caldor City. You know, it shows you how strong that whole concept is. That you had that independent Caldor City, which is one of the best of the independent fan audios that was out there. Really good writing. And you had actors from the series involved, and Big Finish have created their own spin-off on that as well. So it's gone really, really well.
And yet, oddly, and I wonder if maybe this is a mark of the fact that he does struggle to write these days, but oddly, out of all that sort of post hoc material that they've got from Caldor City, he's only written 1 episode of 1 audio drama. He's not responsible for any of the rest of them.
I do wonder, because he was writing the Star Cops novelizations just on for a fan basis at one point, which I've never read, I have to say, so I don't know what they're like.
Jim, any more thoughts? Did you read any of those books?
I'm afraid to say I didn't, unfortunately. I do want to get hold of Caldor City, though, because I think that sounds interesting, because there's a little bit of crossover with Blake 7 there as well, isn't there?
Yeah, the Carnell.
Carnell, the
Fendar pops up as well.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'll definitely
spoilers.
Get hold of that then. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In 4 episodes of Robots of Death, he builds a world only by talking about it, really. A world, of Caldor, because we don't go there during that story. He builds a world that people are inspired enough about to, write a whole series about. And with Blake 7, in the Mutod podcast, every episode we do a thing about world building, because unlike Doctor Who, of course, it's with its kind of anthology approach. With Blake 7, because it starts from a point and then just continues, and you get sort of drip-fed information about the Federation, how it works, and then how it changes. That's really important. And we often discredit Terry Nation. I don't think a lot of that perhaps was from him, whereas I think it's Chris Boucher showing his ability to build worlds like that, which inspire people to. I mean, there's a lot of Blake 7 fiction as well, isn't there?
Yeah, and again, we talk about Robert Holmes. Yeah, we talk about Robert Holmes. A lot of the worlds are in the dialogue.
Yeah,
it's exactly. Where great it, and that is a hell of a skill, particularly for a script editor on a budget. If you can do that, you're laughing.
Here's a question then for somebody who's not seen Blake 7 in a fair number of years. Are the Robert Holmes written, Chris Boucher script edited episodes of Blake 7 the sort of shining stars in the Blake 7 firmament that the Chris Boucher written, Robert Holmes script edited episodes of Doctor Who were? I mean, that was a very complicated question, but I guess what I'm saying is, can you still feel that the two writers have a decent relationship when Holmes comes across to Blake 7 and writes a couple of episodes? Because what I remember of them is that they're very odd episodes, but very enjoyable ones.
I think Orbit is astonishing, particularly for an episode so close to the end of the series. For what it does to the relationship between the main characters, it's a stunning bit of work.
I think it does Gambit as well, doesn't he? Which is on that sort of pleasure planet. Aubrey Woods, is it from?
Aubrey Woods. Is it Deep Roy with the chess? Controller.
Yeah, the Clute.
Yeah,
Clute.
Yes,
chess player. That's brilliant. I mean, it's not exactly a comedy episode, but it's getting there.
I like to think Ryan Johnson watched that just before he wrote the Last Jedi.
Maybe. That would explain a lot.
Yeah, I mean the other episode comes early in season 4 when Chris Boucher is scrambling to get the series made, so you can't really tell much. It does work, I think, but it's not. I don't think it's as well regarded. I don't think it's as good an episode.
Oh, if I remember, wasn't Blake 7 supposed to finish with series 3, and then all of a sudden they got a 4th, and they had to put it together rather quickly? Or am I completely misremembering that? That might just be.
That's true. The circumstances are preposterous. Basically, I think it was the controller of BBC One.
Was it Hugh Weldon?
Hugh Weldon. Yeah. He was watching the finale, which was supposed to be the finale, of Blake 7. It's supposed to end there. This is really good. Commissioned another series, and he got hold of the continuity announcer and said, "Say it's coming back at the end." And the first any of the production team or cast knew about it was when they were watching their final episode go out, and suddenly they were expected to turn up and presumably shelve any plans they had and just. Crack on with the next episode, because they start from sort of ground zero at the beginning, and Chris Boucher has a hell of a lot of work to do to start, because he does rescue the first episode of the last series, where he has to start putting the building blocks of what they had, because the Liberator, spoiler alert, tune out if you don't want to hear what happened now. The Liberator's destroyed, their main spaceship, with all the functionality that had, teleport and high speed and the rest of it. And then so the first few episodes of the 4th series are them trying to get those things back, and he disguises it cleverly in the first episode, because there's a kind of gestalt entity that they meet. It just looks like an ordinary human. It's a twist on the
picture of Dorian Gray.
Picture of Dorian Gray, and in fact it's called Dorian, this character, and because he's this kind of strange hybrid, he lives for hundreds of years, and he works for hundreds of years on teleport systems. So the Federation haven't cracked it yet, but he can, because he's got so much time to work on it. So he kind of slips it in plot-wise. He manages to make an excuse for them getting teleport technology back. So there's a hell of a lot of work to do, just to get back to where they were, before the last episode sort of thing. So that is it. You can't run a business like that. It's just a crazy thing to do.
And the thing is, it's a new producer he's got to work with as well, because obviously Dave Maloney had moved on, so they have to get very Lorimer in. It's chaos.
Yeah. Well, on that note then, Chris Boucher pulling irons out of the fire and creating something that should never have existed. A star, I think we can probably agree, that burnt brightly, even if briefly, and who's, you know, given us some absolutely amazing television memories, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So that was Chris Boucher then. Until we do this again, I was JR.
Jim.
And I was John.
And we will speak again soon. And now I have to remember where Skype have put the stop button. There it is.